getting support, especially for your mental health, is such a crisis in this country at the moment. But changes need to be made. I don't know who can make those, but I need to put it out into the world that it's not okay, and there needs to be more dedicated mental health services for people with disabilities, because we are more complex.
Jenny, welcome to Disabled and Proud. How are you today?
I'm not bad. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited we can finally do this.
I am so glad we have had this in the diary like on and off for so long. So it's so nice to be able to sit and chat, like talk all the stuff that we want to talk about.
Yeah. It's been long in the planning, but there you go.
But these things, do you know what? Sometimes like best things are what you wait for. So fingers crossed. I'm sure it'll be a banging episode anyway.
That's some pressure. That's pressure now.
No pressure. Like if it doesn't go well, we can always re-record. It'll be fine. So the first question that I like to ask everybody that comes on this podcast is, how do you refer to your disability?
I just when I saw this question, I was like, I totally understand why she's asking it. But to me, it's a really weird question because I just refer to myself as disabled. Like I just keep it simple. It's tricky for me because I'm disabled and I'm chronically ill. And those things intertwine, and in different circumstances, I'll say different things. Yeah. But generally, it's disabled or chronically ill. I'm not one for the medical model of disability. I do a lot of work around awareness of my conditions, but I don't casually share my conditions with random people on the street.
Yeah, and I think there's so much to be said in that, because I think whenever disabled people are asked, like, oh, like, what have you got? Or like, what's your condition? There's almost like this automatic expectation that you will share your medical information. And actually, that's very private information. Like, you don't have to share that with anyone if you don't want to.
Not at all. And I used to do it all the time when I was younger, and also when I was first starting out in advocacy, because like that's what you did. I was raising awareness for these very little known conditions. But the more I've experienced in kind of medical trauma and the more I've just experienced of life, like I don't have the energy to explain my quite complex conditions, multiple conditions, to everyone I meet in the sake of awareness. I do my awareness thing online, and then I put that to bed, and I have to focus on me, and giving out my medical information to strangers shouldn't be something that's expected. It shouldn't be something anyone should have to do, and there are a lot of reasons why disabled people might not want to share that, but as you say, it feels very expected from people, and that's one of the things that I really want to see change.
Yeah, I love what you just said as well about, I will raise my awareness online and then I'll put it to bed, because I think people forget that automatically, like outside of this online world, sometimes we don't talk about our disabilities all the time in everyday life. Like if I'm sat in the kitchen making an omelette, my first thing on my mind is not necessarily the fact that I'm disabled.
Yeah. 100%. Like, and I don't want to be known as that disabled girl or be just my condition. My disability and my condition is very, very important. It has a huge impact of my life, but it's not the only aspect of my life. And it's a tricky thing to straddle, because you want people to realize that you have a disability and you have access needs and you might need extra support and things, but you don't want that to get in the way of just being you. And I think that's important to have that separation. Like raising awareness is my job. It's something that making content is something that I am very lucky to get paid for. So that's my job. And then I have to put that aside. And that's something that took me a long time to learn. So yeah, unless I am speaking in a job context, I'm not gonna. I'll signpost people to my YouTube channel, to my social media if they want to learn more. But unless I'm not gonna just start chatting about it.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really, really important point, because I think people automatically assume that because you share like bits of your life online, or you share awareness, that automatically in real life you're going to do the exact same. And actually, you're so right, like it very much is a job, and like it's not a traditional job, it's not like a 9 to 5 job, but it is a job nonetheless, and you're still being paid for your work. And therefore, and it's not like, oh, if I'm not being paid for it, why should I share it? It's not that. It's actually a bit more self-preservation than that, because it's like, actually, I talk about this a lot anyway, and I just need to have some time to sip my coffee and kind of not even think about that type of thing.
Yeah, I spend a lot of energy on it when I'm at work, so I just like to step away. And there's no forgetting I'm disabled, but
Yeah.
there's not having to bring up all the tough things about being disabled all the time. But yeah, I had someone comment on one of my videos recently, like I was explaining, like, don't go up to random disabled people and ask them what their disability is. But then I'd said, follow me for more disability education. And I was called out on that for like saying, don't ask me about my disability, but ask me about my disability. And it's a very different context going up to random people in the street and asking about their disability. Even like colleagues and acquaintances that you aren't really close to, as opposed to being a friend and asking in top context, or it being someone's job to educate you about disability.
Yeah. Something I'm going to hark back to that you said as well is that disability and chronic illness is something that's like very intertwined in your life. And actually, I was wondering, is there a way that you differentiate between the two? Because I find it really difficult to differentiate between the two. And I'm always like, is it one thing? Is it another thing? Are they the same thing? Are they different things? And I was just wondering like what your perspective on that is.
I think it's such a tricky line, and I think it's for every individual to kind of decide where they feel. I don't know. It's a tricky one because
Yeah.
I know people who are just disabled, like they just use a wheelchair, and that's the only disability they have. They're not ill on top of it. And then I know people who have chronic illnesses that don't consider their chronic illness to be a disability. I'd probably consider it to be a disability, but they don't necessarily. Things that are quite common, like diabetes, that kind of thing, that is a really chronic medical issue that I would say is a disability, but they wouldn't recognize that themselves necessarily. And I think for me, because I've got this crossover, I'm a wheelchair user, but I have chronic health conditions that are not very much to do with me being a wheelchair user. And I've got all this stuff going on. I've also got chronic mental health issues, and I'm kind of in the process of discovering my neurodivergence. So like there's so many aspects, and I think that's something important when it's Disability Pride Month, and I kind of share like this section on the flag means this color means this. It's like all of those things are included under disability. So it's a tricky one, and I think it's something for people to self-identify as. I think when my illness was more invisible, I definitely used to identify more as chronically ill than I did as disabled. And I don't know whether that's something that's come through as I have needed mobility aids more, but that's not the way it should be. I also think I've grown in acceptance a lot since kind of the early days of having a chronic illness, and now 7 or 8 years later, to kind of accept that I'm disabled, and that's the term that I use. I was never against it, but I didn't feel like it belonged to me maybe in those early days, which I think is something in the community that's very difficult, because I think it does belong to everyone.
I love what you just said about acceptance, because I remember I've had a lot of different conversations surrounding disability, but a theme that really, really comes up is almost if you're diagnosed with a disability or you acquire your disability, it's almost that, when do you become disabled enough to call yourself disabled? And it's a really tricky question, and it's a really difficult terrain to traverse. Like it's not easy, but something you said about acceptance, as I became more accepting, I was able to call myself more disabled, which is essentially like everybody's journey, but it's also a very personal journey because they're very individual, and some people might be accepting immediately overnight. Some other people might take 10 days, 10 years, 10 months, whatever. But it's that very much the beginning of the journey is awkward and uncomfortable, but actually as you kind of dive into it a bit more, you get more acceptance of yourself and what you can and what you can't do.
And I think people also like forget that it's not a linear journey. It's
Yeah.
not overnight. Right, I'm disabled now. Like I'm gonna always be super accepting, because don't get me wrong, like on my social media channels and everything, I always strive to I can't think of the right word, but to make sure people are accepting, and to allow people to be accepting of their own disabilities. And I get a lot of questions, like you were just saying, about that kind of like, when am I disabled enough? Like when am I allowed to start using mobility aids? I think they might be helpful, like this kind of things. Like there is no, and it grinds my gears so much when I like apply for a disabled like ticket and a carer ticket, and they're like, you need to show proof of being registered disabled, and I'm like, there's no such thing as being registered disabled. There are such things as having various benefits and other points that where we've had to prove our disability, but there is absolutely no one that is going to tell you you are now disabled. So I think that's, and as I say, it's not linear. I have days where I don't feel disabled enough. I don't, despite that being the complete opposite to how how I appear online. But I still have those days, and it's been 10 years since I got sick. So it's not linear, and I think people need to remember that it doesn't matter where you are in that journey of acceptance. You're always going to have those days where you're like, I just want to be able to do this.
Something you said about 10 years ago is when you got sick, and I was actually wondering if we could talk about that a little bit more, because for you it was more about discovering and diagnosing that you were like unwell, and then that evolved into something else, and then here we are, lo and behold, there's a chronic illness and there's disability thrown in with that as well. What was that experience of going through that kind of God, now I'm looking for the word. What's the word that I'm looking for? Honestly, this is the ADHD in my brain. I'm like, I have the word, and I can see this word like right in front of my
ADHD brains.
It is, and I can see it. It won't come out of my mouth, and I'm like, what is that word?
I feel seen.
What was that experience like for you, going through that like diagnostic period, and almost coming to that point where you're realizing that there is something not quite 100%? I'm not the same person I was like 3 years ago. What is it like now? What was that like for you?
Oh, like the being sick and undiagnosed is the worst time. Because I was constantly told there was nothing wrong with me, or it was just anxiety. Had a doctor tell me I was being dramatic. That period was horrific. And it's such a tricky thing. Like, looking back over my life, as soon as I got diagnosed, you could see all the signs and symptoms, and as soon as I've gotten diagnosed with everything that I've gotten diagnosed with over the many years, it's like, oh my gosh, I make sense now. But so you can see it's always been there. But when it really started affecting me really, really badly, and I realized that wasn't normal, I think that's the thing, is the point of realizing what's outside the normal. If you have a condition which you've been born with but doesn't show itself immediately, it's kind of realizing, oh, okay, not everyone feels like this, or can do this, or has been through this. And it was such a difficult situation. Basically, what happened for me, I did my first year of uni. It wasn't even my whole first year. My first term of uni, um, I started getting really unwell.
Mhm.
And it was headaches for me. They were awful. Um, Awful, awful, awful. And I had no idea what was going on. I've always had headaches since I was 10 years old, really badly. And this was worse than anything I'd ever experienced. And it was constant and it wasn't going away.
Mhm.
And I went to the university medical centre and they're like, oh, like, we'll do these tests. I was extremely lucky to have private healthcare at the time under my dad's work.
Yeah.
Went and had some MRIs. They MRI'd the wrong bit of me at first, which was helpful.
Can we just pause for
Uh,
a second? MRI scans are a lie, and I can tell you why. So I once got scanned in an MRI scan because they thought I had a trapped nerve in my shoulder, which I
mm.
didn't. But they couldn't find my arm in the MRI. So I'm not surprised that they scanned the wrong part of your brain. Like, I totally understand that I have a shorter arm, but it is still
Yeah,
very much attached to my
it's
body.
there.
It is there. Like,
No,
so
so
I can
they
completely understand that.
honestly, like, I thought that they'd scanned my head. They had not.
Yeah.
They had scanned my neck down, which wasn't where the problem was. So I went back to just suffering and not knowing what was going on with my body.
Mhm.
Um, had And then I was put on some medication, which kind of calmed things down a touch for a little while. It was like, okay, I enjoyed my summer after having a really bad experience right at the end of uni during my exams. Got through it, and then went back after the summer. And that's when, so I've got a condition called POTS, which is a form of dysautonomia. So it makes you really dizzy. It makes you
Mhm.
really nauseous, and you can't be upright for very long. It gives you palpitations, all these kind of things. So I started experiencing those symptoms from kind of out of the blue.
Yeah.
I'd make my way to university and feel awful and couldn't carry on. Got sent to the medical centre loads of times. Got sent to the hospital by ambulance several times,
Mhm.
and there was nothing wrong with me because, of course, with the hindsight, you're like, oh, well, they laid me down for ages in the hospital before anyone saw
Yeah.
me, so all my symptoms calm down like they do
Mhm.
when I lie down.
Yeah.
And then, of course, it was just back in the rigmarole, and me having no idea what was going on with me, knowing it wasn't normal, knowing there was something horribly wrong, and I couldn't do anything. I was doing everything I could about it, and I ended up having to leave uni with no answers. They did eventually at uni MRI the right bit of me, found something, was not the
Mhm.
thing that actually was the thing.
Yeah.
um, but that's when I was called dramatic by a neurologist, because he was like, "Oh yeah, well, your brain's slightly off, but like it's normal. You're being dramatic." Like I had something called a CSF leak,
Mhm.
um, which was picked up later, 2 doctors later, 3 doctors later, um, which was something that could be fixed, unlike
Yeah.
my other stuff, and was fixed. I'm very thankful to have been leak free for a long time now. But that's what was causing
Mhm.
my horrific headaches. I used to call them my screaming headaches because I was that in pain.
Yeah.
Because all I could do was scream and cry and wait for it to stop. Uh, and that's why no pain medication was working on me. That's why nothing was working. Yeah, it was a traumatic and stressful time of my
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
Um, and to then take that time out of university, and then I was diagnosed with everything else.
Mhm.
So to be told to go from there's nothing wrong to there's these 3 very big, supposedly rare, um, major things affecting you
Mhm.
was like, I'm sorry, what?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
and on one hand, you're so grateful that you finally have answers. And on the
Mhm.
other hand, you're like, dang, I've got like 3. I mean, the CSF leak thankfully wasn't chronic for me, but I've got 2 major chronic illnesses that are disabling and will be for the rest of my life probably, like everything's going to change. Everything that I
Yeah.
thought was going to be is going to be completely different.
Mm-hmm.
And going back to uni, after surgeries and things for my leak, to a completely new year group. I was joining in the middle of when everyone was kind of already friends.
Yeah.
Like, to navigate that as someone who's newly disabled, I was, how old was I? I can't remember, but I was in my very early 20s using a walker at a university doing
Mhm.
drama. It was a completely different life very suddenly. Even though it had been gradual, it's such a weird one.
I always liked to talk about that because I think people need to realize that you don't just suddenly get given like a handbook that explains to you what your life is going to be like. It's not like, oh, here is the disabled handbook. You have option 3. Go to subsection A and you will find out how to navigate this world now. That doesn't exist. And it's really interesting talking about almost like medical negligence, but also a lot of medical misogyny, because I know so many women, and in fact, I would go as far to say nearly every single woman that I have spoken to on this podcast, or those who present as females, all have an experience where a doctor has either said you're a hypochondriac, it's your emotions, there's nothing wrong, you're fine, and like you were told you're a drama queen, and like even myself, I've had that with other things that have gone on in my life where it's been like, no, you're just being like hyper dramatic, and I'm like, no, something isn't right here. And it just goes to
Honest.
show how behind we are when it comes to women in medical care. I mean, I think 1993 was the first year that women were included in medical studies and trials, which just blows my mind, because that just goes to show how under researched and underfunded females in the medical world have been for like however long, since the
That's only
entirety of
two.
time.
That's only 2 years before I was born.
Yeah.
Like, was when, and yeah, I'm. So that's like 30 years ago. Like,
Yeah.
that's wild. Um, and as you say, like, and as you were saying that, I was thinking about all these experiences, and literally all of these experiences have been with male presenting medical professionals.
Mm-hmm.
Don't get me wrong, I had some amazing ones who I owe my life to, frankly. But those initial doctors are like things, because it ended so differently. I was
Yeah.
extremely lucky to find a doctor locally who didn't know what was going on, but was willing to admit he didn't know what was going on and knew
Mhm.
someone who would. And
Yeah.
thankfully, that guy did, and diagnosed me with all three things on the spot. Like, it was sorted.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't sorted, but you know what I mean. But as you say, like, the handbook for disability, it's so tricky because disability is so broad and
Mm-hmm.
everyone's experience is so different. But that's literally what I started doing when I was in
Mm-hmm.
that period where I'd left university, but I was waiting for surgeries and stuff. I was still very unwell, but I was wanting to share and find this community. I started my blog originally,
Mm-hmm.
and my YouTube channel, because I wanted to give people that part of that handbook that I never had.
Yeah.
Um, that's exactly what I wanted to do, and that's what I still try and do to this day. Is give people that handbook that I never had, of all the things that I've learned over the years of being chronically ill and disabled,
Yeah.
because it's needed. Like, as you say, they don't tell you these things. They don't tell
No.
you how to be disabled, and disability is gonna probably affect the vast majority of people in their lifetime if they're lucky to live long enough for it to.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems wild that isn't the case, that disability education isn't more at the forefront of people's minds. Whether that is being disabled yourself, or whether that's helping someone that you know who is, or whether that is just being in the vicinity of disability, which every person on the planet is.
Yeah. Right. And I think we forget that. But what's really interesting is I like to have this conversation that surrounds like the formative years that we have, particularly because quite often disability crops up during those formative years, like when your body is changing, when your hormones are changing, you're growing as an adult. You know, like I didn't realize until quite recently our brains don't fully develop until we're 24. I have only been an adult for not that many years. And I also, as I said to you earlier, I've taken 2 years off my actual age because of the pandemic, because they weren't real years either. So actually, like, I'm still a teenager. But
This is true.
surrounding that, with, you know, your diagnosis coming around about that university time, and generally that's when we think about our careers and where we go and what we do. How did having those diagnoses and your life kind of changing, like literally on a dime, how did that impact your career and the career choices that you then made from that?
It was so tricky because I was in the middle of my degree.
Yeah.
I was always doing drama my whole life. I have been performing. No one like guessed what I was going to do when it got to university and leaving school and stuff. They knew that I was going into
Yeah.
that kind of field. Um, I never quite knew what I wanted to do career wise within that. I
Hmm.
wanted to teach at one point. I wanted to perform. I got very into to theatre tech as well at one point. But then kind of as my disability kind of evolved, I was kind of like, well, I'm going to struggle to do all those things, mainly because my condition is energy limiting,
Yeah.
and there is never going to be a 9 to 5 that's going to work for me. Um, so, and that's like, this is the weird path of life. I mean, I never expected to be on social media. It was
Hmm.
literally while I was off university, I went to go and see my friends in their final year show that I should have been in with them.
Hmm.
Um, and my friend Becky said to me, "You know, you'd be really good at vlogging." And I was like, "You think? Like, I don't really like. I've never really had any experience of that."
Hmm.
Um, but then it was kind of like, okay, like I'll give it a go.
Yeah.
What's the heart? I'd had some bad experiences on YouTube as a teenager, with me singing on YouTube, which we don't want to revisit. Those videos are private for a reason. But I'd had some trolls when I was very very young on YouTube, and
Hmm.
kind of vowed never to do it again. But I was yearning to tell my story and find the community that I'm so grateful that I have now.
Yeah.
So I thought, okay, what the heck? Let's do this. Let's start putting videos out there. And I've had other jobs in that period. From honestly, I don't know how I was doing my degree, being a professional chronically ill person, and making regular content on YouTube. I don't know how I did that at the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
I never think I'd be able to do all of that now. Um, but it was kind of, it was never a job for me originally. It was just something to raise awareness, and a kind of a slightly cathartic exercise.
Hmm.
Um, and then it just morphed over the years, and I had an office job for a little while, and I realized that wasn't the speed for me. I think I realize now that the concept of ADHD and me potentially having it has been brought into my life. I realize why. That was
Hmm.
never going to be for me.
Yeah.
um and yeah, like I'm very lucky to do this strange job that I have in social media, that allows me to talk about disability and educate about disability, and speak to companies and educate them about disability, and do something different
Hmm.
every day. And I had a bit of a wobble with it last year. I had a big wobble in 2023. 2023 was a big
Yeah.
wobble. And I was like, am I going to carry on doing this? And since I've had the support and been able to go back to work and start doing social media again, I've realized how much I love it, and how important it is, and how like much the community means to everyone.
Yeah.
And I that's why I'm so glad my career kind of went in this direction. But it's a very strange job to have, as we were kind of saying earlier. Like,
It is honestly, like, when we think about what we do for, like, trying to explain an influencer type job or even like podcasting to someone who has never like heard of the internet before, you would sound like you were absolutely stark raving mad. You'd be like, well, there are these like little tiles on this screen and people tap it, and when they tap it the engagement grows, and they'd be like, well, what's engagement? And you'd be like, oh, this is a whole new story.
it was funny. So I had some support workers start through Access to Work recently, and they're absolutely brilliant. I love them to pieces. I wouldn't be able to be doing my job at all without them. But like having to kind of teach them about my job, like they were both friends of mine before, so they kind of had a vague idea of what I do, but they had absolutely no idea of the depths of what I do until they started helping me with it. Because you have to be an editor, whether that's photos, videos, podcasts, sound, graphics. You have to know someone who's a very good photographer, or train your boyfriend. Honestly, my boyfriend used to be an amazing Instagram photographer, but since the girl started just 2 months ago, he's completely lost his touch with he's lost that Instagram boyfriend title on his CV. He's lost the edge. You have to learn how to edit photos. You have to learn how to create concepts and briefs and presentations, and like how to create talks and deliver educational messages in a certain way. You've got to be like this creative manager as well as doing all the admin, and like there's honestly so much that goes into a content creator that people do not realize in the slightest. And that's basically why I got super overwhelmed and had to take a bit of a break last year, because it's so much for one person to try and do, and people do not it's so much for one person to do generally. No disability involved. When you add in disability, it just multiplies that tenfold, because you're battling with your own disability and your own energy. But I love my job, and I wouldn't have it any other way. And as I say, I'm very lucky to be able to do what I do.
I love that it's one of those things, isn't it? Like sometimes you do need to have that wobble to realize like how much you love what you do. Because I think at some point, if you haven't, this is a piece of advice for like anybody who's listening, if you haven't had your wobble about like life or your work, it is coming. Like, because everybody has one at some point, whether that be big scale, small scale. Everybody at some point has some form of wobble where they're like, I don't know what I'm doing. Am I good at what I'm doing? Am I okay to do this forever? Do I want to do this forever? All of these like almost existential questions, they are like, they're coming for you if they're not come for you already. But don't be scared of them, because you're going to grow out the other side of it. It's just really effing scary when you're in the middle of it.
Yeah, and we were just taking that age thing into account again. We lost several years for the pandemic, and then you're only an adult for a certain amount of years. So really, we're just experiencing our quarter life crises a little bit late. I think that's...
Honestly, like, I'm really sticking to this whole, like, I'm 2 years younger than what I actually am. Like, I really am. Like, I had 2 years of the pandemic. I worked in health and social care, and they were the most stressful 2 years of my entire life. I think I probably aged about 4 years in those 2 years, so I'm taking 2 years back. And if anybody wants to argue with me about it, I will prove you as to why I believe I am only really something stupid like 26. I'm not. I'm older than that. But, like, in my head... Not been an adult for that long.
I'm 28. I still say I'm 25 just because I forget.
I always forget as well. Isn't it alarming? And you say, like, someone asks you how old you are, and you'll be like, oh yeah, like I'm 24, and then you're like, I have not been 24 for a very long time.
Honestly, if you're not in your mid to late 20s, they are wild times. I think until I'm 30, I'm not gonna know what's going on.
I don't even think when I'm 30 I'll know what's going on. Like, But then I'm quite a chaotic person anyway, and to be fair,
I mean, fair.
I thrive in chaos. So actually, when things aren't chaotic, I'm like, oh, what can I do to create more chaos in my life?
Fair.
For you, thinking about when you were younger and maybe like pre-diagnosis, or maybe even during your diagnosis period, do you have a piece of advice that you would give your younger self, like looking back?
1,000,000%. I think my piece of advice comes around mobility aids, and it's all to do with that acceptance and confidence, because
Yeah.
I get the question so much of like, either like, is it okay for me to use a mobility aid, or like, did I like oh, brain. I knew exactly what I was going to say.
You can see it,
Brain
can't you?
shut
It's
down.
right
Yep.
in front of you, and you're like, I get it.
Yep. 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 Is it going to come back? Maybe. I don't know. Either, yeah, asking if they should use one, or there we go, or being or being afraid to use one, or experiencing a lot of judgment when using one. So I think that it can be really tough, because people can be really harsh, but you just have to do what's best for you in that situation, and ignore other input. Like, don't get me wrong, I advise talking to an occupational therapist or a physiotherapist, if you have access to that, to make sure you're using the aid right. But remember, and I do this metaphor a lot, but glasses are a mobility aid. Like, something to help you open a can is a mobility aid. We just don't see them in the way that we see walking aids, whether that's a stick or a walker or a wheelchair. They're just not normalized, especially in the younger generation. And I had loads of comments on a post I did yesterday about people just commenting that they're too young to be using this, that, and the other. There's no age limit on disability. Like, people, I don't know where that misconception really came from, but I think it's important not to let that judgment mean that you struggle, because I had someone who was in my life who would make me not use my walking stick because they were embarrassed, or put my walker out of pictures, again, because it was just it was a gentle ableism. I mean, it wasn't gentle, but it was subconscious, and then that built into my own subconscious internalized ableism around my aids, and meant I wouldn't use them when I really needed to, because, you know, this person would make me use my blue badge to get us into a theme park or something, so we get the free ticket, and then be like, now put your stick in your bag. And I'd be wearing, knowing he didn't want that to happen, I was wearing supports from my knees to my waist, and then I struggled really badly for several days after, and this would happen every time. And the only person you're hurting is yourself in that situation. And if that's the attitude of someone, it's hard when it's family and you kind of, or someone supporting you, and you kind of have to have them in your life. But if you don't, get rid, because that's your health and your happiness is so much more important than someone's judgment of you using something to help you. They're not going to judge you for using your glasses. Like,
no, exactly. Something that I spoke to Ryan about, Chronically Rye, great human being. What she said, what they said, is something really, really important. It was along the lines of, if you're asking, should I be using it, it's already too late. You need to be using it, because the thought is already there, and you already know that it will benefit you at some point in time. It's just literally, as you said, that internalized ableism, where it's like, oh, maybe I'm too young. And you're so right. Like, there is no age limit on like a stick or like a walker. It's not like they come with a little label that's like suitable for ages 4 to 5. Again, it doesn't exist.
My nana, I love her. I love my nana, but she's 89 and almost 90, and she refuses to use a stick. And she needs to use a stick. She needs to use a walker, really. But she refused. I offered to lend her my very nice walkers. I've got a lovely selection of walkers. She won't use them because they make her look like an old lady. All right, Nan. Like,
Yeah.
firstly, I hate to tell you this, you are an old lady.
You are.
You
Yeah.
are. Like, you're nearly 90 years old. Secondly, I'm your granddaughter. I've been using a stick since I was 20 years old. Like, how do you think that again, word, just how do you think that attitude makes me feel as someone who tries to use my aids with confidence? So I see exactly where it comes from, and that's the more subtle, kind of ableism. That's not the don't use it ableism. But I think you have to remember as well, going off what you were just saying, is you're not tied to one aid, and you're not tied to an aid all the time. If you think a stick would be helpful to, I don't know, walk your dog, but you don't need it when you're at home or when you're just popping into a shop, that's fine. Use it how you need. There's this other horrible misconception that I hate and try to debunk a lot, which is that we are stuck to our aids. And we're not. Like, I'm not sat in my wheelchair now, partly because my home is not accessible, but partly because I don't need it in my house. I can manage the vast majority of the time. I can't always manage. Sometimes I can't move from one room, but that's it doesn't matter. And I went through a phase a couple of years ago where I was using a stick, a walker, and a wheelchair, all for different things. I use my wheelchair much more now because I have to, but there's no right or wrong way to decide to use an aid, and to have an aid help you.
I love what you've mentioned. Like, you kind of mentioned to it, and little snippets of what you said is a lot about that internalized ableism when it comes to disability, and particularly using aids. And also it kind of harks back to that, am I disabled enough to call myself disabled? Because we've got a really strong view of what disability is in the media, but actually in the reality of how it is in real life, they're two very, very different things. But I really like how you mentioned that internalized ableism when it surrounds aids, but also like disability in general, because it's something that we don't always talk about, because it's again, like the vast majority of disability stuff, very, very difficult ground to navigate. But I like that we've had that conversation that surrounds the internalized ableism around AIDS, because not many people understand why it can feel so icky. And actually, like, it just comes down to that internalized ableism, that horrible little voice that's like, society says that I'm this, but I'm actually not. And actually pick it apart and you'll probably find it's internalized ableism.
Yeah, and I love to do, I've said the glasses metaphor already, but I love to do a metaphor with shoes. If you go out and you go to a field and you're wearing high heels, that's never going to work.
Yeah.
But if you go on a beach holiday wearing your wellies, that's not going to work either. Like, you need a different aid for a different day because you need a different tool for a different job. So there's no shame in it. And we just have to remember that. And also, I love going to the definition of disability under the Equality Act, because it's much simpler than people think. A disability is not a wheelchair or a walker or a stick or having a limb difference. It literally says you're disabled under the Equality Act if you have a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on your ability to do normal activities. And obviously within that there's a lot of again, I can't think of the right word, ambiguity around kind of substantial and long-term and normal daily activities. But it's a very simple definition that, if you have a chronic illness, probably applies to you. And if you're disabled in any other way, it definitely applies to you. So, like, I don't think it should be this big, scary thing of like, oh, like, I don't want to call myself disabled. I don't want to use that thing that will support me. And if I could kick younger me up the butt a bit, I would say use the support and use the help sooner. And that's not just physical aids, that's all the support. As I was talking about, like access to work, having support workers, it's been 2 months, but it's changed my life. And I think people have to realize that support and aids doesn't just come in the ways that we might think. And it's important to remember that.
Love that the support and aids don't always come in the way we think. I love to bring it back to positive traits about ourselves, because I feel like, particularly as disabled people, those who present as female or women, we very, very often don't look at the positive things that we can bring to like anything, like whether that be to the world, to the workplace, to the whatever. But actually, if we take a moment to look, what is something or a positive trait that you're very proud of that you inhabit?
I'm just remembering something my therapist said this morning about that's the thing that we've got to work on now is seeing the positive things about myself.
It's hard. It's really, really hard, particularly. I'm not saying it's not hard for other people, because I'm sure as shit it probably is. But when you're disabled, there is another layer that is added to that. And that's to do with ableism and internalized ableism and societal pressures that are put on you as a disabled person. So when we actually have to look at a positive part of ourselves, it can be quite difficult. But that's why I like to ask it, because we need to realize we have some really fucking banging positive traits that we need to start to celebrate a bit more.
I know, and I wish I could, but I'm going to give a roundabout answer.
No, I love that.
But look, it's not a quality in myself, because that's not something that I am able to share next. Have me back in a year when my therapist has done some more work, and we'll see. But I think the thing that I'm really proud of myself for in the last year or so is asking for the help, accepting the help, and listening to my body enough to take some time. I know that I didn't give myself enough time, and this is the thing that we do, isn't it? The thing that we do is find a positive and then start going, oh, but you could have done that. But we're going to try not to do that and say, I took time off, as much time as I could take off when I needed to, because and this is the really it was my mental health that I was particularly unwell with last year, and and I did not give myself enough credit for, as I think many of us with physical disabilities don't do when we are having mental health issues, as I think many people with mental health issues don't give themselves enough credit for how disabling they can be, more so than physical disabilities at certain points. And I think taking that step back to really focus on yourself, and put in the work for yourself, is really important. And I have to be proud of doing that for myself. I'm in a very privileged position to have been able to do that for myself, but I needed to. I needed the help. I needed the support desperately. And I remember Nina Tame actually saying to me at the time when I was going through applying for all this help, which when you're already in a negative mental health space is the worst thing you want to be doing. But she said to me, imagine a year from now when all this is in place and you don't have to worry about this anymore. Like when the next time you feel this rubbish, you're gonna have support in place. And there have been times in the last couple of months that I've felt really low and really anxious and really struggled mentally, but I have those things in place now, and it's still a work in progress, but I asked for the help at the time. I asked for the support with getting the help, which is a really important thing. And now I'm in that position where I still struggle. I'm always going to struggle, physically and mentally, but I have those things in place to help. So you have to do it for yourself. You have to. I wish I'd done it sooner.
I firstly want to thank you for being so honest about your experiences, because I know that these things aren't always the easiest things to talk about, and by you sharing this, this little snippet, hopefully somebody else will feel like they now have the confidence to go and get the help that they should have, or the aids that they need. And I really appreciate how candid you've been about this, because like I said, these are not always easy topics to talk about, particularly when we're thinking about mental health. They're not the easiest things to share. So I do really want to thank you for sharing that with us, or like me, because I think so many people will take goodness away from that. And it is uncomfortable, and it's not necessarily like the nicest thing to talk about, but I think it's really brilliant that you have, and I really appreciate that today.
I think, it was funny for me because I wanted to share about what I was going through at the time, very much so, but part of it was shame and ableism for not sharing, and part of it was the fact that I was in it, and it's so hard to share when you are in it. And again, I remember saying this to Nina, and I was like, I just I want to share, but I just can't right now. And she was like, yeah, but there'll be a time that you can. And and like it did with your physical illness, when you shared things about your physical illness, you wish you'd done it sooner because it helped, but you weren't in the place to. And that's exactly what's been happening with my mental health in the past year or so, is that, this time last year I was in a horrific place, and there was no way I could have talked about it. But it needs to be talked about more, and it needs more support on a whole, because as people with disabilities, like, mental health is so much more complex than just the straight up conditions that we end up getting diagnosed with, because there's that other layer. I remember at the start, a lot of the advice, a lot of the general advice surrounding depression was like, get outside. And I'm like, but that's really difficult for me as a disabled person who doesn't have the ability to do that on their own, and doesn't have the ability to do that without like aids and things that I don't always have access to, and are tricky because I didn't have any of the right stuff in place. But I think there's something to be said as well, like, getting support, especially for your mental health, is such a crisis in this country at the moment. I hate to say that I am still waiting. I've been waiting nearly over a year now for NHS help. When I was referred to the highest tier of needing help. And I'm lucky and privileged to have family who've been able to support me in getting private help. But changes need to be made. I don't know who can make those, but I need to put it out into the world that it's not okay, and there needs to be more dedicated mental health services for people with disabilities, because we are more complex. You can't just give the general advice. It's not anywhere near as easy. And just sending love to anyone that is going through, or has been going through a wobble, as we say, because it's shit.
I really, really appreciate how, like, as I've said, I do genuinely really appreciate how honest you've been, because it's not easy to talk about these things. But let's change the tone. Let's do a little turn. I'm gonna ask you about, okay, so these are actually my favorite questions to ask. As disabled people, because we are not necessarily like average Joe blogs, we quite often get asked some really bizarre questions. And now I was wondering if there is a particular set or one or two particular really weird questions that you get asked about your disability that either like make your brain scratch, or you kind of get a bit dumbfounded. You're a bit like, I don't really know how to answer these. Or do you have like a really quick response for some questions that you get asked about your disability?
I think like it's tricky. I've been quite lucky in terms of not getting too many outside the box questions. I get all the usual stuff, like, but you look well, what happened, like all this kind of stuff. I had a really weird, an odd comment that was a dumbfounded comment. I was in the pet shop with my dog, and I was just using my electric wheelchair going about my day, and a guy on crutches, we were trying to like cross paths, and he was like, oh, and I thought I was in a bad way, and I was like, what? like I think I just kind of did that weird like, okay, great. But I was like, I don't look that bad, do I? Like I'm just I'm just out for a walk really with my today. Like I've just come to treat my dog to some snacks. Like what? Like that was a really weird one. And also there was this, I was going on the Eurostar with a lovely friend of mine, Lauren, and Lauren like had been around, we were university friends, so she'd known me like with my walker and stuff, but you know, we were living in Norwich. It was a very, you know, inclusive place, so she'd never really come up against any kind of ableism in the wild, should I say. And we were getting assistance for the Eurostar, and I was using my wheelchair, and the guy that was assisting us, just whatever we did, would not look at me, would not talk to me. So basically what would happen is he would ask Lauren the question, Lauren would look directly at me, I'd answer the question, and then he'd carry on the conversation to Lauren and just completely ignore the fact that I was even there. Having just asked the question. I think it got to one point and Lauren was like, I don't know, ask her.
Yeah.
So those are some of the weirder ones, I think. Yeah.
Disabled life, do you know what? For all its ups and downs, sometimes it is quite entertaining.
Yeah, honestly, like I had a good laugh with friends and things afterwards, because it was just like, especially the pet shop guy, I was just like, what?
I can so imagine that experience being like, pardon? Like, do you know what you're getting at? But I think I look really good today.
See, this is the thing. Like, I think of great responses after I've been in these situations.
Yeah.
And I have this little video series on my Instagram, which is like, I call it my exactly series, because every response is an exactly to people being ableist in the wild. And like, I would love to have the confidence in real life to be able to respond like I do in the videos, with kind of a like, one of my videos is like what, and I bring in the glasses metaphor, like it's like, oh, but you look so well, you're not using your stick today, and then the response from me is like, oh, well, you're not using your glasses today, like you must be able to see great. And they're like, well, I'm wearing my contact lenses. And I'm like, exactly, I'm just not using something that's visible to you, but it doesn't mean that, you know, my body has magically become non-disabled overnight.
Yeah, like you took your turmeric tablets, you gargled some garlic, like suddenly you're all like, you've done a bit of yoga and some meditation, and suddenly it's like bish bash boss, we're all sorted. Doesn't exist, doesn't happen like that.
I did a video recently kind of on the have you tried type thing, and I'm just like, look, firstly, I've tried everything, but secondly, like none of these things are miracle cures. Like, I don't know what people expect. Like, yes, certain things that are suggested are probably helpful to some people. in their routine. They probably, percentage wise help like a couple of percent, but they're not going to fix anyone. If there was something that would fix, like, not that people with disabilities need to be fixed, but if there was something that was going to cure everyone of pain, like, people would have found it by now and monetized it. So
it's so true. It's so true. I think a lot of people, it's like if someone said to me, like, oh, take this tablet and your arm will grow back. You stop it. Like, don't talk absolute rubbish. Like, it will just never happen.
And you probably wouldn't, even if they would you?
No, not at all. I would freak out massively one day I wake up.
You're like, oh my gosh.
I wouldn't know. I genuinely
wouldn't know what to do with it.
I wouldn't know how to navigate the world. I'd be like, okay, I need to ring my doctor because I need this off. Like, I don't understand. It would not be conducive to me. And people are always like, oh, like, surely sometimes you wish you had two hands. And I'm like, no. Literally never in my life have I sat there and been like, do you know what, my life would be 10 times better if I had two hands. Never has that thought ever crossed my mind, because it wouldn't be. It'd be a fucking nightmare. I would freak out. I wouldn't know how to, like, do anything. I wouldn't be able to cook. I wouldn't be able to clean. I wouldn't be able to live my life. The thought of it actually gives me a bit of anxiety. I'm like, oh,
sorry.
What would that be like?
It's because we all learn to adapt and do things in our own way, and that that is a big thing around what disability is. Like, it's just us doing our own thing in our own way. And I've been a power wheelchair user for a little while now, but I'm trying out using a manual wheelchair, and there's stuff that you have to learn doing that, and that I didn't really know or think about. Like, tiny little steps you have to kind of learn how to do a wheelie and do it safely. And there's me practicing, and there's people like, oh my gosh, do you need help? And I'm like, no, I'm just trying to learn. And I think that's something that people don't realize about disability, like that we do learn to do the things we need to do, and people are like, oh, but how do you do that? I could never do that. And it was just, when you're in that situation, you just do. Like, it's not there's no two ways about it. Like, you just have to learn, otherwise you literally can't do anything.
It is very much that you either sink or swim, and, like, quite frankly, like, I quite like living and I like swimming and I like being able to do what I need to do, so you just swim regardless of whether it's comfortable or not. You kind of just got to go through it. And that classic age old, like, sometimes you just, like, you can't go over it, you can't go under it, you just have to go through it. And that's very much like what disability is. It's just a going through it process, and because it looks different to you doesn't mean that it's any less or any better or weirder. You're going through your own stuff that I might not see, but mine just happens to be super freaking physical. Like, you see me struggling in Sainsbury's, not my problem that you can't handle that.
Exactly. Like, we, as I said at the very beginning, like, everyone's experience of disability is so different, and whether that's people with completely different disabilities or the same disability or condition, that you just experience totally differently. And I think I get that a lot because I suggest a lot of hacks and ways to help. Like, I've tried looking, but there is no one size fits all for things to help and aid and hack, because everyone's so different. And it's a case of trial and error. But you have to let us do the trial and error, and support us through the trial and error.
For sure. I only have one final question for you. I've got to say, Jenny, I've genuinely loved this chat. We have covered some serious ground, and I think it's been so good, and I've loved it. But my final question for you is, are you disabled and proud?
1,000%. Like, it's taken me a long while to get there. And I see it in, like, as we were saying earlier, like, it's hard to see in myself. But when I am surrounded by the incredible community that we share, whether it's, you know, at a friend's wedding, or at something like Nadex, where we both were a few weeks ago. Like, it's just such a joy seeing the disabled community in such a positive light and so much disabled joy. That's where I feel proud of being disabled, is that disabled joy and that disabled community. There's no infighting, or don't get me wrong, there's infighting within the, you know, within the wider realms, but I think there's a great inclusive conversational part of the community that makes me so proud to be disabled, and to share my story, and to help other people going through their journey with acceptance and confidence. And like, yeah, I have wobbles, you know. I can't beat the internalized ableism out of me. I've been working really hard, but it's tough, and you're always going to have those days where you don't necessarily feel proud to be disabled. And I get it on posts sometimes, where it's like, from disabled people, like, why would you be proud to be disabled? And it's because there can be so much joy, and there can be so much love, and yeah, it is hard.
Yeah.
But, you know, and without like being icky and inspiration-y, like, you know, we adapt, we do all these kind of things that you have to tackle with a disability, not without thinking, but often fairly automatically. And those are tough things that we don't give ourselves enough credit for. And I think that we can be proud of that, and proud of trying to make a difference in the world for future generations of disabled people to come.
Oh, I think you've just encapsulated like the whole ethos of disabled and proud. I'm gonna clip that up, and I'm gonna have it.
That's gonna be a nice little.
Yeah, but honestly, I think everything that you've just said is so bang on, and it's about that. It's not necessarily being like, I'm disabled and proud, but it's like, actually there is some real goodness here. Like, we navigate this world when it is not built for us, right? This world is highly inaccessible, and we're all aware of that, but yet we can still carry on and smash exactly what we want to do. And sure, it's not easy, like, life isn't easy, and there's like an extra layer when you're disabled, but we have such an incredible ability to create and adapt super quickly, and like you said, like with second nature, that actually when you look at how much grit and determination there is in disability, how could you not be proud of it? Like, on the whole, you know, I totally understand if that's not where you are, because it is a journey, and like, you're on your journey, but hopefully you'll come to the point and realize that there's so much grit and determination, there's so much to be proud for.
I think that's the thing, and it's that acceptance and that confidence, and, you know, as I said, that little internalized ableist voice is always probably going to be there, but it's just making it be quiet every once in a while, and telling it, no, actually, like, I am disabled, sure, can't do this, but I've learned how to do this a different way. Sure, I need support, I'm going to hold my hands up and admit that I need support. Yeah. But when I have that support, I do a fantastic job. And that's all there is to it.
I have loved this so much. Thank you for giving up your time and coming on and chatting, and like, loved it. And you know what? We'll get you back in a year's time, and we'll have a little moment when we talk about our positive traits. But thank you so much for being on the pod today. I've genuinely loved it, and I hope you've had a good time as well.
Thank you so much. It's been incredible. It's been such a lovely chat. Thank you for having me.